Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, David. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. This is actually my first time experiencing Knoxville. I've passed through Knoxville various times, like traveling to other parts of Tennessee, and maybe stop for a brief moment. But this was actually a great trip because I've been able to kind of get around to a few places in this area of the city and experience a place that I've only kind of vaguely experienced, just kind of in passing, and also in terms of stories and other trips that I've done. I'd like to first of all thank the Kramer family for their passion for the museum and for the arts that they continue. That was experienced both with their family, but in the life of Sarah Jane Kramer. And I think that's a wonderful tribute, you continuing that legacy in supporting the museum and supporting this lecture tonight. Of course, I'd like to thank David and Delana and Stephen and all the other staff here at the museum for making it possible for me to get here in time for the lecture. There was a little mix-up yesterday at the airport. I think there was, some travel issues for a lot of other people because of the weather in different parts of the different states, and so I thought that my flight was going to get bumped. So, so I got a little nervous, but it was no problem. I got here in time to enjoy a little bit of Knoxville before this evening. So I'd like to thank them again for their hospitality, both in getting me here, but also in terms of today in visiting the museum. I call this lecture Expanding Tradition, African American Art and Contemporary Curatorial Practice. I have been working as a curator of sorts, and I say of sorts because I've always been a curator, even when I've had different roles. When I was teaching at the university level, I'd always get pulled into exhibitions. When I was a graduate student, I kind of de facto became, a curatorial assistant, and then even when I was a director for several years in North Carolina, I was also kind of the chief curator. So I'm just kind of continuing a trek that I've done for approximately 15 years or so in curatorial practice, particularly in the area of African American artists. The term African American art is kind of rife with, all of these contradictions. Some people have debated whether that is a term that you want to continue to use in the 21st century. But I've had to, of sorts, live with it as a title. But it's a one that I'm proud of because I'm proud of the artistry and the artists that comprise many of the historical moments that I've learned, that I've studied about for several years. So I put on the kind of the cover image, if you will, of this presentation, an image that is by an artist that you know and love, Joseph Delaney, the brother of Buford Delaney, son of Knoxville. And it actually is, I actually saw it for the first time at a kind of a critical juncture in my own career path, which is kind of interesting for me to be able to bring this up. I had completed my master's program, and I decided that I wanted to take a break from the whole art history thing, for a while. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue and get a PhD. I wasn't sure if I wanted to change careers. I was at the University of North Carolina, and at that time, there was a lot of growth of several programs in the business school. And I remember a recruiter from the accounting MBA program wanted to snag me. They said, well, if things don't work out here, you can come over here and get your MBA. You know, you can combine that art and business, you know, together, and maybe you'll find a job when you when you finish. Forget that PhD program. So to make a long story short, I did not get the accounting degree, but I was still kind of wavering as to whether I wanted to continue. And I said, well, not really interested in studying anymore. You know, maybe I should just take a break from that. But I just want to see some art. You know, I don't want to see any more slides just in a classroom or go to the library for a while. I just want to go out and see some art. And particularly, I want to see some more African American artists. And outside of exhibitions that you could travel to all around the country of single artists, or, you know, kind of finding one or two artists that might be featured, or groups of artists of color, I decided to go to a very popular art fair called the Black Fine Art Show. And it was held in New York at a building called the Puck Building every year, usually in February around, you know, Black History Month, or the end of January. And I just said, you know, this is great because I get to see all of the artists that I enjoyed the most in one spot. It was a commercial spot. It was for collectors to buy, museums, private collectors. But a lot of people like myself became interested in the work and learned a lot because they had lectures and so forth about different works of art that, of course, had not appeared in public collections, or if they were in private ones, you wouldn't have seen them. So one of the various or several dealers that was at the art fair had this particular painting. And I remember I fell in love with it. And I was like, oh God, this is gorgeous. And I'm not used to seeing Joseph Delaney's work as frequently as I would have liked to in other collections. And I was like, I love this painting of the woman with the blue dress. What happened to it? It was purchased. Not that I could afford it, because remember, I'm just fresh out of grad school. So I did buy something in a more economical section of the art fair, but I always wondered what happened to this painting. You know, I'm like, you know, they were like, well, it went into a private collection, you know, we can't reveal that information, you know, and so forth. So I said, darn, you know, that was a great painting. So probably about a decade later, I see this painting again, and it was associated with Larry and Brenda Thompson. And so by that point, I had not only gone back to school, but I'd actually completed my, my PhD program after working for several years. And I was like, this is great. It's all coming together. You know, I'm supposed to be doing this. The painting is returned. Everything is returned. So I always think about this, you know, this painting, and it's kind of ironic that I'm here in Knoxville talking about, you know, talking about my curatorial journey, and this is the image that pretty much connected me back into the field, so to speak, to continue on that journey. So you all might recognize this particular cover, or maybe some of you don't. It was associated with an exhibition called Tradition Redefined, and it featured the work in the collection of Larry and Brenda Thompson. So Larry and Brenda Thompson are collectors that largely lived in the Atlanta area, but they also have they've lived in several parts of the country, Washington, D.C., Connecticut, so forth. But they largely identified with the state of Georgia, and particularly Atlanta. Larry being an attorney, a very prominent attorney, and Brenda being a psychologist. They began to collect art in the late 1960s, early 70s. Really, they began as, you know, during the period that they were in graduate school. began to think about collecting, even though originally they collected, as many people do, posters and prints, things that were inexpensive, and then they evolved as their careers developed into collecting original works of art. But they wanted to have a niche for their works, and they realized the absence of works of art by African Americans in many major art museums, and also in the collections of people that they knew that did collect art. And so they felt, as many collectors of color, that perhaps we need to collect works by artists that look like us. And not that they never collected anything else, but that was something that was very important to them, to see images that were affirming and celebratory of African American culture and tradition. So, fast forward after about probably 20 to 30 years, they had amassed a very large collection with several hundred works of art. So they, over the years, had developed relationships with several art historians, artists, other collectors, and their collection came to the attention of David Driscoll, who is a prominent scholar, curator, artist himself, and basically when David Driscoll saw their collection, he said, I think that you need to show your work, particularly in my space that was named for him at the University of Maryland, called the David C. Driscoll Center. So they worked with curator Adrienne Childs, and she came up with a selection of works, and they called the exhibition Tradition Redefined. And it's my understanding that the name was connected to this whole idea that there is this large American art tradition that they felt did not include several artists that they had in their collection. Many of these artists, some artists are well discussed at this point in history, but for several years had not been. And in some cases, the artists in their collection were being discussed for the very first time just by them exhibiting their works. So Tradition Redefined became a traveling exhibition that traveled from the David C. Driscoll Center, I believe beginning in 2009. And it traveled around the country, different spots. And I believe it came to your museum, was it in 2013? 2013. So in between that time, the Thompsons decided that they wanted a home for their works of art over time. So they made overtures to different institutions. In fact, they donated to several institutions, as they continue to do, but they wanted the lion's share of their works or a core grouping to come to a space in Georgia, because Georgia was very important to their collecting journey. Their son had attended law school at the University of Georgia, and they knew several people there, developed relationships. And if you don't know him by now, well, you should know this name. William Island, who is our current director, got on their radar screen. And you have to know Bill, as we call him Bill. Bill is very charismatic director, very likable. And of course, they fell in love with the idea of working with the Georgia Museum of Art, who had begun to think about expanding their collection of American art to include more artists of color, among other things. So Tradition Redefined, the core grouping of works that appeared in that exhibition, were donated to the Georgia Museum of Art in 2011. In 2012, well, I guess 2011 into 2012. But what they also did is they decided these works need to be interpreted as well, in addition to just being added to a collection. So that's where I come in. So there's the convergence of the Joseph Delaney painting and me again, with their curatorial position that they established in 2012. So And yet another connection to Knoxville, Buford Delaney. This is one of the works that came into our collection. The portrait of Imogene Delaney, the artist's niece, of 1963. And this is probably the, one of the favorites. This is one of the works that is on permanent display. Apparently it was a little bit of tugging that took place prior to my arrival, because I started in 2015, to get this painting away from Mr. Thompson, who had wanted to keep this particular Delaney portrait. So this begins kind of a journey, if you will, of pulling together several works from different periods in the Thompson collection that are of critical importance to the study of African American art, but also to the expansion of kind of an American art, but also Southern art. Our museum, like your own, has a major thrust for Southern artists, and getting those narratives and those stories told anew, if you will, is very important at our museum. And many of these artists, like a Buford Delaney, their stories did not exist in that museum's history or its exhibitions, because the works were not owned by the museum. So this gift by the Thompsons of 100 works of art really became transformative. And this is one of the works that was a very transformative work for them to actually have a Buford Delaney period, but also a strong one. You can recognize his use of the color yellow and his, at the end, in latter years, his interest in portrait making. So I mentioned that not only was it important to get works by African American artists, but also works from a range of periods. The Thompsons were largely tried to collect encyclopedically, and over the years. In the beginning, they probably collected, more artists that were contemporaries with them. Over time, they realized the importance of collecting historical artists, like Henry Ossawa Tanner, as well as a range of other artists. So this Still Life with Apples, dated to the 1890s, was something that they felt was very important to add to their collection. The range of paintings that we have at the Georgia Museum of Art with that fall into the still life category, there are a lot of works by several artists, but a work by an African American still life painter or a painting of a still life by an African American, to my knowledge, I have searched, did not exist prior to the Thompson gift. So there's this whole aspect that's been completely erased, particularly when you're talking about the 19th century or early 20th century of the voices of African American trained artists. Tanner, being a trained artist, studying at the Pennsylvania Academy, was pretty well known to many people, but our collection did not have a Tanner at all. So this was the first Henry Ossawa Tanner. So just as much as there's this idea that there's an absence of works, maybe not intentionally, but just maybe through having the different collectors who could actually donate these types of works to the museum, there's also the space in which these other elements of the careers of artists, come into play. So in addition to more historically driven artists like Tanner, we also had the opportunity, and this was something that made me quite enamored with the collection, is to include works by artists that you maybe heard a sprinkling of historically, or at least in my in my study, but maybe never really heard that much about them, or much more. This particular artist, Vertis Hayes, is not as well known by probably a more mainstream audience of art aficionados or collectors. But I had heard of Vertis Hayes through my historical studies of African American art, particularly in the 20s and 30s, what was kind of categorized as the Harlem Renaissance period. So this particular artist, Vertis Hayes, was connected to a mural entitled "The Pursuit of Happiness," and which was located at the Harlem Hospital. So it was this, large mural series that, actually got restored. The edifice of the building actually includes a scene from that mural series. And outside of doing that, I knew nothing else about Vertis Hayes. I knew he was involved with a group of artists that included Augusta Savage and Charles Alston, which were bigger names. But, there was a picture of him with shades on, but I didn't know whatever happened to Vertis Hayes. So the Thompsons, particularly Brenda Thompson, who is probably more the one that would visit many artist studios, she mentioned that Mr. Hayes, after several years, had returned to Atlanta, and she got to know him, and she began to collect works by him that, outside of maybe she and a few other private collectors, had never shown up in public collections, had never been seen before. And so this would have been a lost history had she and her husband not collected many of these works and make them available to our museum, which would have been in the home state of this artist, who was born in Atlanta. So this particular painting, The Lynchers, also holds a special place in the study of Vertis Hayes, because outside of the more celebratory imagery of a mural that celebrates arts and culture and achievement that I knew of at the Harlem Hospital, this is a more sinister depiction of a lynch mob that is in the process of lynching, we presume, an African American, but it could have been, it may not have been, but more likely it probably did in the context of that time. And I love to talk about this work when we're giving tours, because many people have, when they hear the term lynching, they get used to these images that are conjured up of, a lynch noose or, or violent scenes, the after effect. But this is kind of the image from the other side, looking at the victimizers. Ironically, the title of this was called The Victims. And so Vertis Hayes is inverting this scene of lynch mob goers, so to speak, and they are the victims not because, they are innocent, but because they actually think that what they're doing is right. They're the ones that are sick. They are the ones that are the victims, just as much as the person who has been violently murdered has been. And so this is a very, important painting in not only the study of this particular artist, but also in terms of reevaluating some of these hard social issues that occurred in places like the South, particularly at a time, kind of reliving how in the 1930s an artist looked at, a group of individuals like this, and kind of even looking at it even in contemporary times to some of the things that we hear about in the news. It creates very interesting dialogue. In terms of more contemporary artists or artists that of the late 20th century, the Thompsons probably have the strongest body of their work. And this particular work, Seven Steps, is by an artist named Radcliffe Bailey, also from Atlanta. And you're getting a sense that the Thompsons had, obviously an interest in Georgia-based artists or Atlanta-based artists, partly because of proximity, but also because of their own study of the history of many of these artists. You know, it's very easy to look online, or if you frequent exhibitions in major cities like Chicago and New York, and you know, maybe if you visited artist studios or hear about the careers of many artists, to assume that all of them, you know, even though they may live in those major cities, that they don't really have a connection to the South, or they don't have a connection to, if they were born in the South, to their Southern roots. And if you really look, many of the artists of African American descent, they have very rich roots in the South. You know, if you take a look at even in the context of Knoxville, I was talking with Stephen earlier before this talk, and we were talking about how people had misconstrued different paintings as being scenes of New York, you know, and you know, maybe because he was in New York at the time or in a major city, and they were actually scenes of Knoxville, you know, and he could tell that because of the signage, you know, the street signage or the sign that, you know, maybe graced the front of a particular store. And so, you know, being able to establish that context and having that context take on a broader meaning nationally, and is very exciting in the study of many artists of, you know, like, for example, Joseph Delaney, but even someone like a Radcliffe Bailey, who includes his personal history, you know, thinking about his grandparents or his parents, passing down images that he incorporates into his work. Also, you know, a type of cosmology or a type of belief system in the power of ancestors that not only has resonance for him as a, you know, a person that you know, may have encountered it later in life, but also thinking about transatlantically, that he's thinking about the, you know, Bakongo origins, or you know, African origins in his work, and symbol systems. So being able to kind of make all of those different connections in a museum connection, in a museum space with audiences, has really made works like this, 7 Steps, really important acquisitions through the Thompsons. So I'm just kind of showing just an image of that particular work in our Orkin gallery. And also another artist, you can see what they're gathered around, Beverly Buchanan, who lived in Athens, Georgia for some time, but is also a very important late 20th century artist. And it's not a Thompson work, but it does show kind of what's happening in our contemporary space here. This is probably one of the galleries that I always say, we need more space. We only have like 4 or 5 pieces of artwork in there. I'm like, we're gonna have to push this out into the parking lot. You know, so I've already kind of redesigned the expansion plan. But it also kind of resonates with me about the theme of expansion. You know, our museum had actually just experienced its expansion when the Thompsons gifted the collection to it. And theirs was like the first major exhibition to take place when the building reopened in 2011. So what's ironic is, you know, they were a part of the expansion effort, and they symbolically were the first show. And so now this particular gallery that has the most work by the Thompsons needs to be expanded again. So it's kind of this continuing conversation that, you know, we begin to have about African American artists and their contribution, not only on the national front, but even just locally, that, you know, gets kind of communicated even in images like this of our space. And just in line with that, I just saw this the other day, and I thought that this was interesting because I've been on this mission to try to identify all of the African American artists that are in the collection. So I pretty much nailed down the artists that came through the Thompsons, of course, because that's easy, that was recent. But the museum itself has had a history of collecting works of art by African American artists. And I think that it's important to note that, for institutions to kind of begin to look at, how inclusive they are in terms of a variety of artists from different backgrounds, different different eras and so forth, as they look at their audiences, and their audiences grow. And so this was a study that was conducted of 30 museums. So this is just like a little dot in the whole world of museums, or the art world. So this is 30 art museums. Most of them are the major ones, the MoMAs, the Art Institute, and so forth. And so they looked at the proportion of acquisitions and works of art by African American artists in these collections. And so between 2008 and 2018. And so they only found that they had 2.3% of the works of art were done by African American artists, or that they could identify as African American artists. And then everything else, was a much larger percentage. And so the goal now for a lot of museums, both large and small, is to increase the diversity of their holdings. And part of that is through awareness. In many cases, depending on the composition of staff, of boards, not a lot of people are aware of who those artists are and what their works look like, and how they fit into the overall scheme of art history. And so it takes it takes a lot of effort to even get people motivated to do that without knowledge. So back to my story of my own, calculation of our collection. So I've had my intern, bringing lots of works together, trying to identify known African American artists. And guess what our percentage is? It's 2.4. So we're getting there, I guess. But it's just a, I thought it was kind of a nice metaphor for the fact that it is a struggle, because without the knowledge, without the access to the information, which many of these artists, particularly artists that the Thompsons tended to collect, didn't really have major historical treatments of them, except in the last, maybe few decades or so. Even some of the bigger names that, you think about, that you may have heard, like Romare Beard and Jacob Lawrence, they've just had monographic treatments done in some cases during that period that they created this particular, or they started the initial study. So if those artists that are supposedly better collected throughout the country are just getting the big, thick monographic survey at the major museum, imagine the other artists, where they stand in the historical record and in collections. And so I felt relieved to know that we were further along as a university museum than some of the big dogs that have all the money to buy works of art, or could have bought the works of art when they costed less money. They've increased in price now. But it just goes to show it's a process. So these are two works that have been in our collection since the 40s. Our museum was founded in 1945, and it was built, or the building opened in 1948. But Alfred Holbrook, who was our founder, he actually donated these two works early on. The first work on your left is by Jacob Lawrence, and it was actually collected and donated, or I guess it was purchased for the museum, or it came, through a gift of Alfred Holbrook in the same year, in 1947, before the museum was actually officially open to the public. So that was a huge deal back then. Jacob Lawrence was obviously an important American artist, but he was one of the only African American artists who had gallery representation. So that was largely the only reason why Alfred Holbrook knew about him. He purchased this from Lawrence's gallery, the Downtown Gallery, and many of the other artists that were contemporaries of Lawrence, Holbrook may not have even known about them because he wouldn't have seen them in the gallery setting. On the right is William H. Johnson, another important artist of that period, with this painting, High Peaks. So this is, again, in the original founding collection of the museum, but they were largely isolated for a very long time. Maybe there was an uptick in the late 80s and in the 90s of African American artists, as I look at the accession numbers of many of our objects. But it does show an early interest in collecting those works. So the Thompson collection that I oversee kind of continues that conversation that was begun in the 1940s. So I keep using this term expanding, and we mentioned tradition redefined. And when I came on board in 2015, I had heard about tradition redefined, of course. I recognized the Delaney portrait, but the Thompsons never stopped collecting, by the way. So they have a really large amount of works that have never been seen, and that I went crazy over when I went to their home. And eventually many of those works will be in our collection, but I didn't want to wait that long. I don't want to assume anyone's longevity on this earth, but I just said, we need to see those works out. So I worked with the Thompsons, and we conceived of another exhibition called Expanding Tradition. And one of the other reasons why, in addition to just wanting to share other works of art in their ever-expanding private collection, as well as some of the works that had not been seen in the original Tradition Redefined, is I wanted to do also a publication. And so this is the cover of the publication, which shows our lovely Buford Delaney painting of the original donation. And one of the reasons for this is not just vanity on my part of wanting to have a catalog that I worked on, but also one of a pragmatic dimension. We had run out of the Tradition Redefined catalogs. So, and I remember I asked our director, I'm like, well, what happened? Didn't you get like a box of catalogs or anything? I mean, I need one for my office. And he's like, nope, sorry, they're all gone. Well, there were some around, but I think we had to kind of barter for them. But I said, now this doesn't make any sense. We have the collection here. We're going to get more. We're going to show the more work. We need our own catalog, the Georgia Museum of Art's Thompson catalog. And so I began working on this. And it was great because it actually became a culmination of many of the things that the Thompsons desired for their collection. A, for it to be interpreted, but B, for it to be a part of the larger UGA student community. So we have several interns at the museum who are able to research works of art. Many of them had never studied any of these African American artists. They had never even heard of them from their classes. And so I taught a course at the university that semester, and also had my interns research and several artists that were appearing in the show. And it's a great catalog that we continue to utilize for research purposes, but also to keep kind of brand, if you will, our own reckoning with the collection as it's come to our museum. So here's just kind of a view of what the installation looked like when it was up. We had it in 2 galleries, and we had it divided largely chronologically, but not exactly. In some cases, we just grouped things together based on medium and what seemed natural affinities in terms of form. But this was the first gallery that showed maybe more, works that kind of until 1950, if you will, maybe from the late 19th century to 1950. And we could show some funky colors. As we were beginning to pull colors from the works of art, the various works of art that were in the show, we realized that, obviously the Thompsons didn't have a uniform palette that they collected from. They had a range of works that adapted to different environments. And this is 2 scenes from the other gallery, which is kind of a more longitudinally shaped gallery. And so we began to kind of group stuff kind of pre-World War II, then post-World War II. I struggled because I always want to kind of start out chronologically, but it never quite works that way because nothing is ever perfect. No one ever collects perfectly chronologically, although they try in some cases. Also, the media began to change. Many works were pretty traditional paintings. When you look at the earlier works, of course, then as time advanced, you had more mixed media sculpture and, and other works of art that didn't quite adapt to normal treatment. So it was kind of interesting laying out that show and kind of selecting what was going to go where. And we had, I believe it was 78 works of art when we ended it, and that was a negotiation, which I learned when you're dealing with a living private collector, they want to show it all. First it was a tug of war to get them to show, but then once we decided that we wanted to have the exhibition, then it was like, okay, we've got to cut it off at some point. Run out of space. But it worked out very well. Some of the artists were, I don't know if this has a pointer on it by any chance. Let's see. Oh, well, I'll just point out a few things. So some of the artists were Atlanta-based artists. So this particular painting that you see in the background was done by an artist that's really important to Atlanta named Freddie Styles. This work was done by an artist named Kevin Cole, who's pretty known well nationally. And this piece is a small work of art by David Driscoll, who is obviously a familiar name at this point. And so we began to see it was interesting once the works were installed, how even though they were quite different when you're kind of encountering them for the first time, we saw all these parallels and these connections visually that made them all kind of work together and create wonderful conversations. This is a work that I loved because it had a very interesting story. This is a painting by Wilmer Jennings called The Good Book Says, and it shows a church scene. And this is, again, one of those examples of a work that, had it not been collected and preserved, I'm not really sure if we would be able to even write about it. I had come to the knowledge of this particular theme or this particular scene through a print done by this particular artist, Wilmer Jennings, who was a student of Hale Woodruff, who was an important teacher in Atlanta. He eventually went to New York. He was, in the Harmon Foundation. He was a part of a later group named Spiral in the 60s. So he was an important teacher and artist for several decades. And Wilmer Jennings was best known as a printmaker. an engraver. So I had never seen a painting by Wilmer Jennings. So I didn't think it existed. So to know that the print was based on the painting and that this painting existed was awesome. And so you get to see this scene dramatized of, the preacher, kind of fire and brimstone black preacher, the penitent, souls in the church, the rays of light coming in through the stained glass window, the choir loft. I love the guy in the corner who looks like he's just fed up with the whole scene. And to really be able to talk about this work was important because it connected us to another artist in Atlanta who the Thompsons also collected, because his family had this work in their home for several years. And so she was able to reconnect the artist's daughter, who's a gallery owner in New York, with this family that had also had an artist in its family who had this work, to get the story on it. I mean, it was pretty amazing, to get those stories about these works of art. Apparently it had undergone, some conservation because, it was over the fireplace. So it had gotten, kind of sooty over the years. And so to see now the kind of the vibrant color brought back and to be able to display it and talk about it in the exhibition was wonderful. And by the way, this would have been an Atlanta church scene. So again, there's this connection because the artist was from Atlanta. And, so again, it creates a type of context for these works as connecting with our particular community, but also a much broader view of Wilmer Jennings than previously had been showcased. And sorry, this is a little bit fuzzy, but you probably picked up on this work in the image of the exhibition space. This is by Willie Cole. And Willie Cole is a contemporary artist, and he's well known for not only doing works that feature iron marks, actually an ironing boards, but also he's most popular for these sculptural formations made of shoes. So if you have any discarded shoes, and particularly ladies, he's a great collector of millions of shoes that he turns into works of sculpture. And it's amazing the approximation of shapes and figures that he's able to create through his sculptures. This is called Untitled, and then chicken in parentheses. If you do a Google search of him, you'll see all these really interesting mandalas and other things that he creates with shoes. He also has done, he hasn't just used shoes, he's used water bottles, there's a range of others. He's actually used irons, like physical irons, and created sculpture out of them. It's amazing what he's able to do. So this was a crowd pleaser and really interesting. And it's actually a smaller version of the work he typically does. This is the artist I mentioned that was connected to the Wilmer Jennings painting, Michael Ellison. And Michael Ellison, again, is one of those artists that you don't really hear a lot about. He was based in Atlanta. He taught in South Carolina for several years. But he did these amazing block print images of scenes of, in public spaces, oftentimes places like barbershops or restaurants, and showing people interacting. And this was, again, another opportunity to get those stories, because many of the artists that were in the Expanding Tradition exhibition knew Michael Ellison. And I did a companion exhibit of this artist during the same time that Expanding Tradition was shown. And it was wonderful to get them to talk about Michael and how much of a character he was, but how much of a talented artist he was, who died too soon and was not as well documented as he should have been. And so in the companion exhibit, I showed works like this, particular one called Waiting Room. And the Thompsons were major collectors of Ellison's work at the latter part of his life. I think he died in his early 40s. And so it was wonderful to be able to bring this work out and to see the response and the interest. And so these are some of the artists that we had in a panel, because what we realized was many of the artists that we had selected for the exhibition were dead. So we realized, hey, we might want to talk to the ones that are living, that are from this century, or at least the last century, the latter part of the last century, and get them to talk about their work, which is a rare opportunity. You know, part of the appeal of having works by contemporary artists is that you're able to talk to them and document them in a way that many of the other artists had not, we didn't have the opportunity to do, and others before us had not done. So in 2018, in the fall, I had a treat and working with, again, yet another better known modern artist or modern contemporary artist that, you know, I felt I wanted to do a treatment of and introduce to some people who had never heard of him, and that's Richard Hunt. And for those of you who don't know, Richard Hunt is probably one of the most prolific public sculptors in the entire country. I mean, he's probably done some of the most commissions. We don't know for sure, so we don't want to quote that, but many people have cited him as probably having done the largest amount of public commissions of metal welded sculpted works in the country. You can see many of his works in his native Chicago, where he still lives, but also around the country. And he also had done some works in Georgia, in Atlanta and in Augusta. And we felt like, well, why hasn't, you know, outside of an exhibition he did in Savannah, you know, why hasn't the Georgia Museum of Art done a Richard Hunt exhibition? We have collectors in our, on our board who have his work. You know, we know he's a great guy. And so I said, I had met Richard about 15 years prior and done an exhibition. And I'm like, well, I'd like to do another one for another reason. I want to have a catalog. So here we're back on these catalogs again. Because I realized it's really important to document in, you know, a written fashion on many of these artists. Now, Richard Hunt had catalogs done in the past, but I wanted to give him a really nice catalog, and I wanted to be able to talk about and reflect on his work in a different way than maybe previous people had. And so we came up with the idea of doing an exhibition called Richard Hunt Synthesis, in which we began to kind of connect works from as early as the 1950s to really up to the present era. And here's the artist standing with two works. The one that he's standing closest to is actually a Thompson work. It's owned by Lyrium, Brenda Thompson. And the work in the back is called, well, this one was called, oh my God, Turning Points. Sorry, little blurb there. And the one in the back is called Minor Monument. And Minor Monument is one of those works that appeared in his, one of his major, first major exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art at MoMA, or retrospective exhibitions. He had appeared there before. They owned a piece. But that everyone knows about. Anybody who studied Richard Hunt knows that he did this major retrospective exhibition in 1971. So I thought it was really interesting to, again, this whole idea of synthesis of, you know, showing these works from two different periods and how he kind of evolved, both in terms of material as well as in terms of form. But he always revisits, you know, earlier concepts, where the hybridity of nature and the industrial, you know, and, you know, kind of, you know, always kind of reinventing works that he had done in the past in different ways. And so it was a really interesting exhibition to put together, and to also have the artist around to be able to talk about it with us. And I'm just showing some really quickly some images of other works. This was done in 1973. It's called Pallet Hybrid. I said private collection, but it's the Thompsons. It's public now. And so he created works in several media: bronze, stainless steel, welded assemblage. It's another work that's an earlier work, construction end. So it was really exciting to be able to kind of bring out many of these works. This is another one owned by the Snipe Museum at the University of Notre Dame. And the interesting thing about this is, if you look at Richard's work for a long period of time, you would assume that this was an earlier work done in the 60s, but it's actually a work done in the 80s. So it's again an example of how he revisits these kind of winged hybrid figures using scraps of metal, found metal pieces. And so I thought that that would be important to show audiences how an artist can kind of reinvent himself over decades. And this is just showing like different groups. It was always fun to see the different groups come into the museum for fifth grade tours. It was a popular one in fifth grade tour. And in terms of other things that kind of highlight, the experience of creating a space for African American artists to grow at the museum and in terms of our collections, we also have an award called the Lyrium Brenda Thompson Award that was inaugurated in 2012 by our director. They were the first awardees. And every year what we do is we select an artist that we feel is kind of under-recognized, whether it be in the Atlanta area or otherwise, to receive the award and to kind of celebrate their achievements. And eventually, the hope is that we'll be able to build an endowment for acquisitions, so that the history of many of the artists that the Thompsons collected will not be repeated, in the sense that maybe these were artists that would have been lost had they not been collected by private collectors such as themselves, but that they instead be added to public collections for learning and enrichment for decades to come. And this just shows some of our honorees. The woman with the red scarf is Amalia Amaki, who is in the Atlanta area, and then Larry Walker, who's also from Atlanta. Many people might know that name Walker. If you've heard of Kara Walker, that's her father. And so we thought it was important to honor those individuals and to create a space by which we could eventually add to our own collection. And again, the whole notion of acquisitions and adding to the collection doesn't just stop with the Thompson Award or with the Thompsons themselves. Many of our museum supporters have been very generous in terms of helping us add works by African American artists to the collection that we've sought after for years. One artist that we hope to do an exhibition on, Edmonia Lewis, was one that we were lucky to be able to acquire through auction. And this is Minnehaha. Edmonia Lewis was a 19th century sculptor. She traveled to Rome and created several works. Many of her works were of abolitionists, maybe to honor them or commemorate their work prior to emancipation. Some of them by other notable figures, but she did a lot of works related to Native American subjects. The artist was part African and part Native American, so scholars are still grappling with how she depicts Native Americans and trying to figure out if she actually has is trying to talk about her own identity, but using some of the popular characters or tropes at the time in literature, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Highest Song of Hiawatha, excuse me, and this depiction of, one of the star-crossed lovers, Minnehaha, was important for us to add to the collection. And this just shows some viewers who originally saw the work when we unveiled it at one of our Black History celebrations. I think it was actually the one where Larry Walker won the award. And so this is kind of, again, an attempt to expand the tradition of American art by the inclusion of, by strategically placing many of these works in different periods. This is probably the era that we have the least amount of works, is obviously the 19th century. And so to be able to add a work by an African diasporic artist to that section was important. And so this is our latest Thompson Award, showing the artist Leo Twiggs, who won the award this year, and Mr. Larry Thompson, and some of his works in our gallery. So one of the things that we're grappling with now is that for many years, in some mainstream spaces, but even in other spaces, there was always this concept of the group show of African American artists, that singular show that you had of groups of African American artists, and then you didn't see them anymore. They weren't in the collections, or you didn't see them featured throughout the year, except maybe Black History Month. And so this was our first year actually, outside of works that we maybe have in the permanent collection, like you saw, trying to basically reassemble some pieces from the Thompson collection into a kind of a Black history show. And it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, you don't want to isolate or segregate, if you will, works of art by, race or, ethnic background. But on the other hand, it's important to highlight and to celebrate those artists at particular times of the year and so forth. So you're grappling with, well, how do we have a Black history celebration or Black history without a Black history exhibit or Black artists and in their own show? And so carving out a space in the museum and making sure that there's a exhibition dedicated to artists of color that's of a significant amount to make it a show is something that we're working through now. So, obviously, diversity as a whole is important, but also, kind of isolating to uplift temporarily in certain strategic moments is important as well. So just to kind of, wrap up, there's a lot of projects that I as a curator, want to do. Many of them relate to how certain artists are kind of revisited, that maybe they were given, again, a cursory glance in terms of their work, or they're being revived in other settings, and therefore it gives me an opportunity to revisit them as a whole. And one artist that, again, has a connection to Georgia, she was born in Atlanta. Everybody seems like they're born in Atlanta, but not all of them are in our collection. But I had actually started working on this artist when I was working in North Carolina. And I was never able to do an exhibition of her work. And so I said, when I came to Georgia, if it's the last thing I do, I want to do an Emma Amos exhibition. And at the time that I said it, a lot of people were like, well, she is, a really good artist, and we really know her work. It's very familiar. People recognize it. But it's not her time yet, So that was what I heard maybe about 10 years ago. So when I first came to Georgia, I said, I'd like her to be one of those Thompson Award winners. If we haven't nominated one, I would like to nominate her or have someone nominate her. So to make a long story short, she was nominated and she actually won in 2016. But unfortunately, the artist had become, somewhat health challenged, and then since then has somewhat deteriorated. And, but also since then, so she couldn't come to the event. But also since then, her star has risen. And so she's appeared in several major traveling exhibitions like Soul of a Nation that traveled from the Tate and was at the Brooklyn Museum and other exhibitions around the country. We Wanted a Revolution, a lot of treatments that relate to her work that was done in the 60s, like this work. And they're very bold in color. Some of them are, her later work was very expressionistically done. Kind of reminds me in some ways of Joseph Delaney's style. And so she was known as a colorist in terms of her work, but she was also a textile weaver and printmaker. And many people have her prints in their collections. And so I'm like, we need to do a retrospective of some sort, or a survey. Maybe retrospective might sound a little dated, but a survey of sorts. And so we've been working on doing a survey that I hope will travel. She's got so many works, so many wonderful works, it's just hard to narrow down the list. But she's also important because she's worked the majority of her life in New York. She was the first woman in the group Spiral that I mentioned when I mentioned Hale Woodruff. And so she was known as a feminist artist. And as people are beginning to reconnect with the histories of women artists, the stories of women artists of color is beginning to kind of take steam as yet another understudied or under-recognized area that needs treatment. So I'm hoping that this will be a successful venture to showcase this particular artist's work and to kind of let audiences rediscover her or discover her for the first time. And as a side note, again, contributing to the literature on artists like Amos, no one has done a major publication on her. And so, this would come at a time where there's an openness to studying many of these artists of color, women artists in particular, and adding them into, an ever-expanding canon of American art. So these are some of the things that I've, worked on since I've been at Georgia. And I think it's kind of a great time, to begin to talk about, the importance of history making and not just history on its own. And I love the work that you all are doing here with, for example, with Buford Delaney. And I think that it kind of speaks to the importance of, connecting communities to artists and beginning to kind of creating new histories or expanded histories, of many that are either fallen or, many that are even still contemporary with us. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'd invite any questions that you might have of me, but thanks for inviting me. Okay. Trying to see if I see. Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned any of the so-called untrained black artists, Finster and Simmons,
well,
Bessie Harvey, and Mary.
It's interesting you said that. I was talking with, when I was talking with Stephen earlier, I was thinking, I said, I forgot to put Thornton Dial and Clementine Hunter up. We do at the University of Georgia, we actually have a pretty extensive collection of self-taught art. And we have it in the, I don't know if I had it in one of those galleries that I showed. I think I didn't have that slide. And that's also another good point that you made, because when I did the, when I worked on this exhibition, you know, one of the things that came up was, you know, you have so many works by artists that are, you know, trained artists, you know, maybe have gone through the academy, you know, what are you going to include of the self-taught area? And so I included an artist named Archie Byron, as well as an artist named Harold Rittenberry, who is actually a local Athens artist. And in other parts of the museum that I wasn't able to show, we have works by Thornton Dial Sr., Purvis Young, Clementine Hunter, Finster. Well, he wasn't artist of color, but we have that as well. So, so yeah, that was also a part of my discovery of our collection, is to kind of think about, hey, there are a lot of self-taught artists that, you know, it's easy to forget because some of them are not documented in a lot of, you know, publications, but also in the academy, you know, that chapter, if you will, sometimes gets omitted, you know, in the study of African American art. Somehow some self-taught artists, maybe the really famous early ones like Edmondson, you know, maybe will show up, you know, in a discussion, but the latter ones often only get a footnote. And even I've been a victim, or excuse me, a perpetrator of that, you know, just by training. And when I mentioned the statistics that I was trying to create for how many works of art by African American artists in the collection we have, the majority of those artists were self-taught artists. And that was, again, you know, through just kind of looking at them like, wait a minute, there are all these self-taught artists that we have yet to really begin talking about them in context much more than we have since I've been there. We had a previous curator who pretty much focused several exhibitions on self-taught art, but just in my own work, I'm still trying to think about how I want to frame that if I do an exhibition of a particular artist that would be classified as self-taught or folk, or, you know, so that's a good question. Sure.
So I'm just curious, of the museums that you visited in this country that are devoted to a broader art story and art narrative, which museums are doing a really responsible job of collecting great work by African American artists and are exhibiting it in a really responsible, inclusive way? I'm just curious if there are some front runners in the line.
Okay, now this is being recorded, so that somebody might hear.
Just do the initials.
I mean, I think a lot of people are doing some great works. A lot of it is, you know, I kind of look at it in terms of, you know, the exhibitions that I see, you know, when I've traveled around, when I've had the opportunity to travel to some spaces. In terms of some contemporary exhibitions, I love a lot of the work that the Brooklyn Museum does, you know, whether it be a traveling show or whether it be kind of a homegrown exhibition. I mean, to be honest with you, if I was just going to categorize, you know, I think that, you know, university museums and, you know, smaller museums do a lot of great work. Places like Duke University, you know, I lived in Durham for several years. They've done some really great work, particularly solo exhibitions. I mean, there's a lot going on. I mean, you know, around the country. I mean, it's hard because, you know, the museums that get the most hype, or, you know, the most, you know, publicity, you know, they often get publicity for those particular exhibitions, but you don't really see the backstory of what they're doing in other, you know, in other senses, in terms of other types of acquisitions, and hence the statistic makes sense. You know, you get the hype, you know, but you don't always get, well, really, how many pieces do you have in your collection? You know, or what are you really doing to increase diversity or inclusion? So that's still a hard question for me to answer, but I do like a lot of, you know, exhibitions. You know, when I travel to New York, I always have to go to the Brooklyn Museum, you know. But yeah, that's a good one for me to ponder.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.